to be really straightforward and true, the pencils should be sharp no matter what the milk price is, because oftentimes when the milk price is high, the feed cost is also high, and really the margin may be the same.
Welcome back to the Hoards Dairyman podcast. Today we are with our special guest, Steve Martin, with DNMC Milk. And he's been a guest on here before, but offers a lot of good insight. So today we're going to be covering the difference between northern and southern feeding strategies. So we can just hop right into it. And Steve, you have worked, I'm guessing, probably in each region. Let's start with the South itself. Historically, what did dairy nutrition look like in the South when you first started to now?
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to grow up as a beef guy and trained as a beef nutritionist in college. And so when I came out into the dairy world to figure out what it was like feeding cows that are dairy cows instead of beef cows, I think the industry was really a lot like it had been for the previous few decades. So the timing from then till now, obviously everything has changed in those years, right? I think that the South in general has made some real strides. And so if the question is, what did it look like when I started? For me, it was all new. If a guy came into my job that had grown up on a dairy or had experience in the dairy world in a previous job, it was just kind of the status quo. The South, there were dairy sheds, obviously, just like there were everywhere. Most major metropolitan areas would have a dairy shed. And so there were, just like the other parts of the country, smaller dairies. I think that they were characterized a lot by forage. And I think that if you look about the world and how different dairy systems work, you can probably start with what type of forage base they have. And that probably answers the majority of the rest of the questions. And so in the South, up through that time, the forage base was grass forage and mostly dry hay and not really good quality hay. If they grew something that approximated silage, it would be like what they might have called a cane hay or a cane silage. And really what it was like a sorghum Sudan grass, or more of a Sudan grass type forage. And so I think up through that time, it was like all forage is the same. And so you just need to have forage, and there wasn't any alfalfa anywhere. So if you start talking about differences, I mean, if the king and queen of dairy forages historically has been corn silage and alfalfa, whichever order you want to put those in, I mean, the South essentially mostly had neither of them. Now, there were places in the South where corn silage might be found. And we're going to talk about generalizations here. So I'm sure there's some individual dairies that maybe had come from a different region or done a lot of traveling that figured out some things. But for me, I stepped into like East Texas, so a place called Sulphur Springs, Texas, which would have been one of the traditional dairy sheds in Texas. And like in 1990, that area was full of 100 to 150 cow dairies. 300 would have been a really big one, and there was probably plenty milking 50. And they would have been feeding some type of parlor feed, which may have been a pellet, or it may have been a mixed feed. So the pellet probably would have come from a national or a regional feed company, and then the mixed feed may have come from some small local feed company, or maybe even a mixed mill that they would have had on the farm where they ground corn and soybean meal into a blend. So the forage base for that was mostly either one of two things, either grazing. And so that could have been really good or bad, depending on rainfall and what time of the year it was. And then, a round bale feeder of hay, some kind of hay, probably the same hay that the beef cows next door were eating. So yes, I think that's the way it was characterized, and really hard to get butterfat in those days for those type of rations. The hooves weren't healthy. So yeah, a little bit of a tough situation to start to learn how to feed cows in a pretty antiquated system for me.
Yeah, definitely. And compared to the northern friends, definitely some limitations as to feeding and weather. It's a whole different landscape down south, obviously. Do you think that they were a bit behind because of the beef cattle culture around the area?
I think maybe so. I think there were probably a lot of people that were dairy and beef people, and obviously some of the dairy cows look kind of beefy. And And I guess I should say we're talking mostly about feeding, but we probably should say also that I think the genetic animal that the South had to work with was not awesome until honestly fairly recently. I think we've really in the last couple of decades caught up in that area. But a lot of dairies in the South would not raise heifers. I even remember pretty common to use Brahma bulls to freshen the refreshing cattle, dairy cattle, and so you had these really cute looking floppy-eared Holstein cross Brahma calves that were really kind of cool. But so they were buying heifers from up north, and so then the creation of the job is called the heifer jockey, I guess. And so this was a guy that either lived down south and had friends up north, or lived up north and had friends down south, and they would go put together loads of heifers from Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and other places up north, and then bring them down and either run them through sales or kind of sort out and bring loads to dairies to keep their herds even. And certainly a lot of seasonal breeding, so that was really a big deal. If the dairies were keeping their heifers, it was very, very seasonal, so there was always holes in that freshening. And so the dairies would get really long in days of milk and then really short in days of milk. So the way that impacted feeding is, are you like way long in days of milk and it's hot in the summer and you've got bad forage? Or are you really fresh because you finally got some cows pregnant and they all calve at the same time, and your days of milk is finally low and it's rained and you've got good grazing, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, we're getting some milk. So it was really not steady at all. So I think that when we tried to look, anytime any of us went up north and visited dairies, it was like, wow, this corn silage looks amazing. I wonder why we can't have this. So over time, we have figured out how to have it. There was some plant breeding that went on in the University of Georgia at Tifton Substation in South Georgia. And there was a researcher there named Glenn Burton that was like the pioneer king of breeding grasses. And so he really improved the Bermuda grass. It was kind of the basic default grass across the South. This was back before NDF digestibility was something we really thought about, but he knew about it. And so as that forage base got better, we were still feeding that stuff through round bale feeders though. So there was that big limitation.
For sure. What other limitations did you see people on the farm facing down in the South?
So if you step out of the forage realm and then you realize the genetics deal, and I guess I didn't really finish my thought before, but the point about the genetics is that nobody up north was selling their best heifers into this heifer jockey guy, the guy with the gooseneck or the ground load trailer that was going up and getting loads of heifers and bring them down. So we were getting the best heifers, obviously. I think that was certainly a limitation. Housing and cow comfort and these things, I know that the whole industry has gotten better, and perhaps some of the dairies up north that may have had some more structured housing where they were in tie stall barns or freestall barns that were old fashioned and bad airflow, bad loops, bad bedding, all the bad stuff that we do better at now. I just still think in some situations those cows may have been better off than ones in the South that may have been in what used to be a pasture when they milked 50 cows, but now they're milking 250 cows, and that pasture has turned into a dry lot. And so they're standing out in this dry, dusty, and then it's not dry and dusty and it's muddy. And so, cows standing in mud, high somatic cell counts. And so that cow comfort thing was just not even on our radar. I think that impacted everything. And looking back, I think that if you had the perfect genetics cow, even if she was well fed, if she was living like they lived back then, I think that she wouldn't express any of that genetic potential. So, and I think that there's just, except for a few places in the South, there's just not the dairy culture that exists up north. And there are some places in the South that 50 years ago would have had a really strong dairy culture. So this isn't broad, but just the dairy culture of really being on top of doing things well and really having the pride in that. I think that's something that's come later. It was a challenge to come and have really good production success, reproduction success, culling success. All these things kind of just were a challenge.
Did you kind of have the mindset that they could reach the potential that they are reaching today?
Yeah. I remember the first time I was on the dairy up north, it was high corn silage ration and pretty good cow comfort, and it's like, yeah, this is really something. And I'm thinking back where at that time as a feed salesman / nutritionist, I was trying to pick the right feed to put in the parlor that they could go slug themselves with 2 or 3 times a day and then go eat that bale of hay. I think maybe the first break in that might have been the mixture wagon, right? So I think up north, people were feeding silage through some kind of silage unloaders and these contraptions that I remember seeing that had these chain drags on them that would put silage out of an upright silo into a bunk line and stuff. And I'm sure there were some of those in the South too. But in general, when we thought, hey, we could probably do better with a mixture wagon, I think that kind of was the beginning of some opportunities to be better.
For sure, and a lot of innovation going on in that time period. So was there an interest amongst the producers that you were seeing as to the difference between the areas and why there was that difference and how they can get better? Or like I said, was it just pretty standard, this is the way it's going to be?
Part of what spurred the South on was people coming from outside the South to the South to milk cows. There were some key places during the 80s and 90s where there was some expansion. And so you start having dairy people come from other areas and bringing new ideas. And then, everything just gets better over time. You start having more connectivity with veterinarians and nutritionists and feed company people that were from other parts of the country that came and bringing ideas. And so I think just the coalescing ideas from different areas, began to put in people's minds, it's like, okay, I can do this better. Do I work on improving my feeding first, or do I work on cow comfort first, and trying to pick the ways? And a lot of these people that came to Texas or places like that to milk cows, they came into antiquated facilities that there weren't a lot of dairies built. There were a lot of dairies that were existing that were added onto, and so those end up being sometimes some crazy layouts on dairies where you start putting a pin here and put a pin there, and you push out a wall and make a parlor bigger so that you can milk a few more cows. And usually all that stuff just makes cow comfort get worse. So you might milk more cows and maybe you set up some systems to feed them better, but now you're cramming more animals through the same infrastructure. And so there's certainly some negatives there, but I think that the mixture wagon was a key thing, but the problem with mixture wagons is they're not really made for that round bale of hay.
No, they are not.
Yeah.
Well, as you're working with, you had mentioned that people from the north were kind of transitioning down into the south, and you had mentioned Sulphur Springs, Stephenville area, and now as we're looking at the map today, it's like Lubbock and all that, those places. How did they start to adapt strategies from the north, and did any of those end up not working for them?
Yeah, so it's a melding of ideas, right? So if you start thinking about some different dairy towns, we can talk about that, because I'm really like talking about these dairy sheds and why they were there and whether they survived, and if they did, why, and who used to milk cows there and stuff like that. I think that's really interesting. But so the mixture wagon I keep coming back to, but the challenge was in those first mixture wagons we had were horizontal boxes, right? So they had like 4 auger horizontal boxes, and so we had this long stringy Bermuda grass hay that we were trying to put those boxes. And so then comes the hay grinder. So we started grinding hay, and then I think when the mixture wagons went from being horizontal mixture wagons to vertical mixture wagons, I think that's where we began to say, okay, we can start processing some of this forage better, because the concept of a TMR was maybe what we were chasing. So we which is funny if you think about now with the robot feeders, the PMR, the partial mixed ration. Like we were doing that in, guns a-blazing in 1990, where you might have you're feeding in the parlor, because you always did feed in the parlor. You had a system to feed in the parlor. The cows were accustomed to being fed in the parlor. But then you get a mixture wagon and you go pour a feed lane. And so us as nutritionists, we were like scrambling. It's like, okay, well, what do we do with cottonseed? And maybe we can go a little further away and find a corn farmer down the road 30 or 40 or 50 miles that actually we could get them to grow silage for us, and then bring it in, and you're going to stack it. Where are you going to stack it? And so we started, little bit at a time. We found ourselves feeding in the parlor, feeding some outside mixes that may have been mixed on the farm in some kind of rudimentary commodity barn, and some kind of little small mixture wagon, or who knows, a mix that may have come from a feed company that had cottonseed and beet pulp and some other things and some byproducts in there. And then I think really we found out that to really make those mixes work, we had to figure out how to feed silage in the South. And so I think that if you look at the models that emerged by the time we got to say year 2000, I think there are two really solid models that emerged. One was the dairy that figured out how to find silage somehow, either grow sorghum silage, or go further away and find a way to get some corn silage, even if you have to truck it 70 miles, which some people did. And the other thing that happened in this time was the Colorado alfalfa hay started coming into Texas. And so when that Colorado alfalfa hay came into Texas, I think that was the beginning of another change. And so we had rations in those days that may have had as much as 20 pounds of alfalfa hay in diets.
Wow.
And so thinking back on those, man, a lot of nutritional principles that I understand today, that I look back on some things that we had to learn the hard way, like those 20 pounds of alfalfa rations worked great when you fed them in a 4-auger horizontal box. And there were these big, hairy, ugly, sortable rations, but milk pretty good as long as your hay was good. And then we had then showed up the vertical mixture wagon. And so then we took that same diet and put it in a vertical mixture wagon and took that big, ugly ration and ground it up into kind of the length of a corn silage ration. And then we had real problems because the only reason that 20 pounds of alfalfa worked is because it was kind of long and stringy and they had to chew it. When we made it short and took the chewing away, then lots of bad things happened. So nutritionally, maybe we intuitively understood it back then, but we didn't have language for things like potentially digestible NDF or physically effective NDF or the things that we do now. So the forage analysis world was growing at the same time. So you take the dairies in Texas mainly that I'd be thinking about that were beginning to do that. Some of those dairies thought, hey, I can move my dairy to the high plains, Amarillo, Lubbock, Dalhart, Hereford, and actually go somewhere where silage grows well. And there was an existing feedlot industry there to serve that. And then the other kind of dairy that I think made it nicely through the 90s, maybe a little more common in East Texas, and then even crossed through places like southern Louisiana. So if you think about Louisiana and Mississippi, think about the map where that state border is horizontal as opposed to north and south. That horizontal border, there was a really good chunk of dairies in there. And those dairies were really successful milking, 1 to 200 cows in those days. The economics worked for them. They haven't survived the newer economics, even though there's still a handful of dairies down there. And we actually have a chance to work with a few of those, which is a really fun change of gears for us because those dairies still really kind of live and die by grazing ryegrass. If you're down that far south, you can have a really long season ryegrass crop and you can graze and get nice, if you can time your reproductive success with the fall and the cool season and even into the spring where that ryegrass is really good, you can have some successful milk production with really low cost of production. And so those dairies, I think the dairies that had that pasture base that they could have forage quality, because unlike the Bermuda grass, that ryegrass was, like rocket fuel. And so those dairies had some legs through the 90s and early 2000s. And then the dairies in Texas maybe that thought, yes, let's either go further north and, either Southwest Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, or Eastern New Mexico. Even to this day, a really good handful of really solid, good dairy business people, good dairy families have really made a really good, successful run now for, I guess, into the third decade in Stephenville area, Erath County, Texas. And they're growing sorghum silage there successfully, a little bit of corn. They still bring some alfalfa from up north, but they found they can go a few more miles down toward the Brazos River Valley, over toward Waco, and find some places where corn actually grows pretty good. Probably some of the longest truck corn silage in the U.S., but it really can be good. And then as the Bermuda grass that I talked about, that breeding that's happening in Tifton, Georgia, even when I was back in school, that has continued. And so those Bermuda grasses that really, really grow well in that region and really respond to manure application and solids and liquid application, the NDF digestibility on those has gotten better as well. So take that, and then you, instead of making that Bermuda grass into stringy dry hay that you're going to put in a round bale feeder and hope they eat it, you're making nice silage out of that, and you're putting it in a bag because it doesn't go great in the pile, and you're feeding really high NDF digestibility type material that you grew. It's a perennial crop that you don't have to plant every year, that responds well to manure fertilization, and you've got some really low cost forage there.
Yeah, and it certainly sounds like they had adopted to the forage piece of the equation. And I know, I mean, like you said, not just in the South, but everywhere, farmers have been more focused on cow comfort and things of that nature. But the difference between the North and the South, I think, is kind of the obvious, is the heat.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect feeding in the South
Yeah.
compared to the North?
Well, clearly it was one of our Achilles heels in with our cow comfort history, which was nothing. There's a great story during the 90s, maybe early 2000s. There was a lot of heat stress research going on at the University of Arizona. And then I think there was also some really good stuff going on at the University of Florida, just to name two. I'm sure there was more. But I think the guys that learned the most about cooling cows in those days was a group of feed salesmen in Louisiana. And it's a great story. One of them, I can't remember his name now. He was a former New Orleans Saints football player. And he and his feed sales buddies down there figured out that if they could figure out how to cool cows in the summer, that their feed sales numbers wouldn't just plummet. So, I mean, you got cows eating in the parlor and then going out and, grazing or whatever in this heat. They just didn't eat much. And so I remember when my income was tied more to feed sales. I mean, you didn't like the summer because you just didn't sell as much feed, and it really, hurt your income. So there was a feed dealer down there that I remember that I think that there was the staff there. They knew more about high pressure pumps and what nozzles to use and check valves and all the stuff about how to put water on these cows. And it's just obviously it's great. Everybody wanted the cow to be more healthy and have better feet and get pregnant maybe in the summer, instead of standing there with their tongue hanging out. But I mean, honestly, the impetus for that was to make sure the feed trucks kept rolling. And so cooling cows was huge. And to speed that up to today, it's come a long way. I mean, we had, during the middle, there was cooling ponds. I don't know if you even know what that is, but people would take and fence off their shades in a dry lot, mm-hmm. and have these cooling ponds, and the cows would basically walk into this murky water and cool themselves off and then go eat at a feed lane and then go lay down. And even if that water was dirty, I mean, somatic cell counts would go down. And it just shows you that dirty water plus less stress is better for udder health than, a really clean environment and lots of heat stress. So, I mean, all kinds of iterations of that stuff. I even know a guy that fenced off during the day his freestall barn, because the freestall barn was not as cool. No fans and misters, then those cows go cycle through that cooling pond. So speed ahead to now and look at all the technology that we have in cooling cows with smart soakers that work off ear tags, all the right pumps, all the right droplet size, fans everywhere. And not just any fan, but, design fans to move the right amount of air. And you put them on every post or every other post? And do you aim them at the bed or do you aim them at the feed lane? There's a total science there. And, my current work in Florida would be the area that I see that the most. And yeah, those cows eat less in the summer, but I'd say in no area has the dairy industry in the South made as much progress as they have in that. And if you really want to see cows cooled well, go to Florida or go to Stephenville, Texas, and see how they're cooling cows in those freestall barns. And I think that would be bulletproof in heat stress anywhere in the world.
Well, we can certainly learn a lot from each other, regardless of if one was originally doing better than the other. I think that's that statement is not true anymore. And like you had mentioned, when it comes to genetics and crossbreeding, how has that kind of amplified how the southern dairies are doing now?
Yeah, there's always been the concept of that the crossbred cow maybe more heat tolerant, has a better chance to get pregnant during the summer, maybe can survive the summer with better hoof health and all the risks that would go with heat stress. And I think that maybe the Jersey can do a lot of that herself better than the Holstein. But there was an emphasis in crossbreeding to tackle some of these challenges. I think that when that really took off and changed was when the dairies, the way they were paid for milk, started to represent more of that component-based pricing. So if you're going to get rewarded for protein, for instance, certainly you can afford to have less milk, because those cows will give less milk, right? But they may not give less milk solids per unit of dry matter intake. They actually maybe give more. So I think a lot of the South really said, we may not have as much milk as our cousins up north, but we probably have a lower break even, and we might do really way better than you would think at the milk production level. And so now in today's world, I think we've caught up. Now, these crossbred cows are never going to give as much straight up. But like say, if you use energy corrected milk, I think they're gonna compete. It brings up a point with much fear and trepidation. I wrote an article, a response article this summer to the 7-pound craze.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you remember that.
Yep.
I really expected pushback from that, and I didn't get a lot. The milk per cow versus milk per whatever other denominator you want to pick. There's a lot of different ways to get to what's the right answer for that for each dairy. It has a lot to do with your environmental and your ability. Can you milk more cows, or can you not milk more cows? Can you put manure out all year long? Do you have fields around to do this? And so, even the concept of milking twice a day, it's like, well, if you think that the best club to be in is a 7-pound club, then, I can't imagine. I mean, it's like anybody that's milking twice a day just must have rocks in their head, right? So,
yeah, for sure.
So amazing, when you start looking at that, and depending on how you're paid, and depending on whether you can milk more cows or not, and how far do you haul your milk, and is hauling high solids milk an advantage for you compared to hauling, milk that may not be quite as high in solids. So I think if you tell the story of the Southern dairy industry, you have to include the crossbred cow as being part of it. When I think about that crossbred cow, it's something that reminds me that every, the calculus for maximum return on investment, return on whatever your metric is for success on a dairy, there's times that the crossbred cow is the best fit for some situations. And, it depends on how you get paid for your milk. It depends on how far south you are. I think those crossbred cows can probably have some more advantage further south. If your feed cost is higher than average, they have a better feed conversion likely. And so if you have less feed input and higher value milk because of the components, I think that it may surprise you. I know there's some dairies in the South that are well respected that have really culturally changed the vernacular and their language on the dairy. They don't talk as much about milk per cow anymore. And if they do, they talk about it in energy corrected milk. If you can milk more cows, and depending on how successful reproductively your dairy is, and how much the beef cross calves are worth, and there's a lot that goes into that. It's like, what kind of milk are we going to chase? And if anybody decides that the right answer for them is to milk twice a day, and they're successful, then I just think it shows that it's a little bit ingenuous just to assume that always more flow, more, 7 pounds of solids always makes more money. Well, it might not, depending on some stuff. And maybe most times maybe most of the time it will. I know there's some people that aren't chasing that are very successful, that are very smart. And I trust that they've run the numbers and they think the way they're doing is right. And so as a nutritionist, then you have to say, okay, well, what do I do with that? Does that make me feed the cow any different? You have a crossbred cow that has a smaller intake package, but they also make less milk, and it's the ratio of what you put in to what you get out, and what it costs to build the input and what you get paid for the output. And whether you push that through a big, tall Holstein that's going to set records, or a smaller, maybe not so pretty crossbred cow that, oh, by the way, might have better hooves, and she might get another lactation, and she might have got pregnant quicker, and she might have had other positives in her story that also work into that profitability. But I'm sure someone knows what the percentage of crossbreds. I'm sure someone in the genetics or the semen business could tell you this immediately. But the advent of the beef on dairy cross has changed some of this, right? So is that beef cross worth as much coming out of a crossbred? I'm not sure about that. I know coming out of a Jersey, maybe there's a question there, but but yeah, I think that the crossbred cows are a reminder to me to just do the math. Don't just assume that the biggest milk is always the most profitable. And maybe that's a distinctly Southern thing. I don't know, but I bet it works up north too. And that, and that's the beauty of visiting dairies in different areas is you see things that, I think in the middle of my career, like I quit going to meetings for a while because every time I go to meetings, I just get discouraged. It's like, gosh, why can't we make as much milk down here? Are we just dumb? Do we have bad cows or bad managers? Are we bad nutritionists? What is it? And I just think it was a lot of things. And it was, maybe at the base of it was forage quality and genetics. And so I think now we figured out the forage quality part. We don't feed 50% forage rations much in the South. I've got some 30% forage rations that milking really good and making really high butter fat. Well, you need some byproducts to go with those. You can't just feed, medium quality forages and corn. So you're really working hard to try to figure out what byproducts go with those diets. But when I go up north and I see some things, it's like, golly, I wonder what I can learn from that. And my guess is that, yeah, anybody that dairies anywhere ought to spend some time or know somebody in the South or particularly the Southwest that knows how to feed cows when it hadn't rained in 3 years, because that could happen anywhere, at any dairy. To be in a forage pinch, it's like, okay, what do I do how do I build a ration at 30% forage that will hold cows together and not ruin these animals and still make a nice return? And so I think the regions probably can learn a lot from each other for stuff like that.
There's a lot to learn between. One might have a whole different set of challenges compared to the other. And just out of curiosity, Steve, I had a discussion with somebody the other day that the Holstein has caught up to the Jersey in terms of components. And I'm not sure down south what it looks like, if it's primarily Holstein, Jersey. You were talking about the crossbreds. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I won't name him, but I heard a very prominent, well-respected, that everybody would know, scientists say the other day that the Jerseys, and this was in a meeting, so it's not like it was quiet, but Jerseys as a breed better catch up, or they're going to, he said, he used the term museum breed. Okay, so I thought that was a little harsh, but the point is well made. That I looked at some data. I get weekly data from all of our clients every week, and there's a dairy in Kansas that I think last week, a Holstein dairy that had a 4.9 butterfat. And so that energy, and I don't know, protein was 3.5 or something. So, that dairy is right at 100 pounds of energy corrected milk. And I guess I didn't know whether we could ever get there in the deep South. And we have achieved it. And so I know part of it's genetics. We've got butterfats that we can't quite explain. The nutrition models kind of look at them a little sideways and said, I'm not sure what to make of this. Part of it we've been buying by adding palm fats and using a lot of rumen available methionine. And so the ROI on that's been pretty good. But with the milk pricing we have for 2026, we're looking at that again to make sure that is right. But I mean, I think your question is like, has the Holstein changed and turned into something like a big Jersey? And how much of that's genetics versus nutrition, I don't know. But I just want to make sure that there again, just like the 2X versus 3X, or how do you want to, what kind of cow do you want to have? We just need to do the math to make sure that the cost inputs are respected on the value of the output. And sometimes that, maybe 75% of the time that comes out like you think it will, because you're just your intuition or your experience or whatever. But there's some different dynamics, I think, nowadays that change some of those answers. And so we just need to do the hard work and, check that.
That was a good answer, because that was a question that really made me think in my lifetime that we could catch up to each other, to those breeds. It sounds like from your perspective that the South has caught up basically to the North in terms of nutrition. Where do you see it going in the future? And is there a spot where they'll just remain equal forever, or is there kind of a competition there?
I remember a meeting 7 or 8 years ago, and Mike McCluskey talked about the 150-pound dairy. 7 or 8, 9 years ago, that seemed like a long way away, but it seems a little less crazy now. it could be that every pound from here is going to be harder than the previous pounds. But if you look at energy corrected milk or solids, I think the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, it feels like it's been a layup to get this more milk. It's like, man, what's everything seems to be working, and that's a lot of fun when the value is there for the cost that it took to get that done. If the reward for the production is less, then I think the ingenuity and the effort to get the rate of increase the same will go down. So I guess that's another way of saying the lower the milk price is, I think that gain is going to flatten out. But I do think it's interesting from a sustainability standpoint I think this is the time to think, could we potentially, even if you can add as many cows as you want, maybe we do need to try to figure out a way to do the same milk with less cows. There again, some places that's probably going to be the right answer. Other places is like, that sounds like a crazy answer. We need to milk more cows, more cows, more cows. And so, the dairy producers, dairy businesses that have survived the last 3 decades, most of them, I trust that they've really been through these numbers and their advisors, and they've picked their path. And so everybody's path is not going to be the same. I would add that people up north might be surprised at how many cows in the South are still milked on dry lots. It's like every cow is not in a freestall. And if you go places, Southwest Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, Eastern New Mexico, Arizona, there's a lot of cows that are in dry lots. And I'll tell you, if you run a good dry lot dairy, it's not easy. There's a lot of pen maintenance. There's some clients we have in Kansas that I think that their science and voodoo and managing their dry lots, and what type of scrapers and how deep and what speed and which direction do you push it? It's like, this is science. It's not like dry lots or some kind of sophomorish approach to milking cows anymore if you do it right. But there's some geographies that it's never going to be the right answer. There's some geographies that it may be a toss-up. And so it's like, well, if you milk here, then you can decide, do you want to milk in free stalls, or do you want to have really good dry lots? And then some places where it almost never rains, it's like, man, I can't imagine how a free stall would have a good ROI. But there may be a dairy there that says, look, I just don't want to milk in a dry lot. I want to milk in a freestall. And so they can make that work too. So I think the housing is going to be an interesting question, because in those areas where you have a mixture of housing, you go to Southwest Kansas and you could have a dry lot, you could have a 4-row freestall barn, you could have a 6-row freestall barn, you could have a tunnel vent barn and a cross vent barn, all in the same county. And maybe that's the same up north, where you have these different cross and tunnels and positive pressure barns and negative pressure barns and all those things that I really don't know much about. But I think mixing the dry lots in there is something that makes the South unique. Even all through all of Texas and New Mexico and even some in Colorado, some dry lots that would surprise you. Wow, I can't believe that. But it doesn't rain a lot in Colorado. So it could be a good choice. One other thing I want to mention about the high plains that I think is something we talked about as we got ready for this podcast is flaked corn is maybe a luxury in the South, and mostly the Southwest, and it's because of the proximity of the dairy industry to the feedlot industry. So I don't know how many other parts of the country. I think California probably has a fair amount of flaked corn. A lot of ground corn fed in different areas, and particularly in high corn silage regions, ground corn might be the right choice. But if you're in regions where you're feeding a lot of sorghum silage, a lot of grass silage, and byproducts and stuff that are powdery, the flaked corn really ends up being a nice addition to that ration. And so the flaked corn is maybe uniquely Southwestern. You see it in Colorado. You don't see it as much in Kansas, but Texas, New Mexico, really flaked corn heavy, and it's a really a fun product to feed, and has some unique differences to even fine ground corn.
Very interesting, because we're used to it here, so you never really think about it being kind of a luxury item in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
And it's come up quite a few times now. Kansas. How do they feed cows there? Is that considered north or south, or just this gray area?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure myself growing up in Alabama, I'm sure I thought Kansas was in just as much of the north as Wisconsin was. But if you look at Kansas, is kind of a state that's got two dairy areas, and the southwest part of Kansas, which would be Garden City, Ulysses, Liberal, in that southwest area, and even over toward Syracuse, so that maybe what maybe the south of the interstate I-70 there, in the southwest corner. It really kind of functions a lot like the high plains of Texas or New Mexico. You kind of find that in the industry, the salespeople, nutritionists that service those. Sometimes Colorado gets lumped in that group too. So if you took Colorado, Southwest Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, and maybe Eastern New Mexico, there's a lot of similarities in that. It's low rainfall, pretty high elevation in part of it, but Kansas is a little bit of a mixed bag, because Kansas has the same latitude as somewhere like Dalhart, for instance. I think it's maybe fairly even, but there's quite a bit of elevation difference between Dalhart, Texas, and Garden City, Kansas. So Garden City, Kansas may end up being like maybe in the summer it's a little bit more like Stephenville, whereas in the winters maybe a little bit more like Dalhart, but still pretty arid climate. Now, Hilmar had the big expansion there in Dodge City, and so I think with that expansion in Dodge City, Kansas, the Southwest Kansas dairy market, moved to the east. And so I don't know, I'm sure somebody that knows it that lives there, every mile you go east from Garden City toward Dodge City, you get more and more humidity. The elevation drops a little bit, more rainfall. And so, that'll be a positive. Like for those dairies that are over there, they'll get a little bit more rain and they'll have a little less irrigation pressure, and that'll maybe end up being good for them. But Kansas is just like two different states. And then there's a dairy industry that I have never really worked in, but Northeast Kansas has a handful of really, really good dairies with really good genetics. And I would say those guys to me feel way more like Iowa or Nebraska. And then Garden City feels way more like Dalhart. And so I think it depends on the state. But Kansas is unique, been a unique place for me to feed cows, and great dairy people. It's a good place to grow corn, and there's a lot of open space and not a lot of people, and that tends to be not a bad place to have a big dairy.
This brings me to my golden question. We certainly can learn a lot from each other, and when you had talked about this being the topic of the podcast, when people from the north come to the south and try to help you guys out, but what is the honest opinion about that?
Well, we can keep it funny, right? I don't know. I'm sure I'm not the only one that anytime someone would come visit us from the north, and I mean, I experienced this quite a bit in my feed company days, and not that it's not like they were sending missionaries from Wisconsin to teach us cows. But I mean, clearly, I think if the roles were reversed, I think I probably would have felt in some type of higher position, because our cows in the north gave more milk, and we fed probably better rations, and our forages were better, and our cow comfort was better, and our genetics were better. I mean, it just goes on and on. And so I would actually hope they come down and, after spending a few days, say, golly, with what these guys have to work with, they must be pretty good. If they were feeding cows up north, they'd really be something. But the people that I've worked with and been close to in the business, the nutrition business, we kind of have fun with that idea. And it's like, yeah, those guys are coming down from Wisconsin, and it's going to take about a day to, let them figure out that feeding cows in a 7,000 cow dry lot dairy in Portales, New Mexico is different than maybe anything anywhere in Minnesota or Wisconsin. And so, what usually happens is, we're maybe embarrassed by our preg rate, or embarrassed by our milk production, or like, gosh, why is your butter fat so low in the old days? And then after a little bit of time, it's like, yeah, you guys have a handful of limitations that are meaningful. And so the good news is that, for myself personally, there was, that I kind of had that guard up. And so and there are a handful of people whose names I could name that got past that guard to me and really were instrumental in helping me feed cows better over the years. And my guess is that they learned some stuff from us too, kind of some war stories about what it's like to to feed cows in the South, and hopefully they learned a little bit too. But yeah, we make fun a little bit of what we feel like sometimes when they come up down from the north to help us out, make sure we're trying to keep us from lagging too far behind. But I think that's more a relic of the past, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certain if it was vice versa, it would be the exact same way. But now we're kind of on the same path going forward. So it can only go up from here, and I'm real curious to see what the future holds. And do you have any advice for going into 2026? I know that the milk prices haven't necessarily been a bright spot for a lot of dairy professionals, but any advice to close out with?
Yeah, I think I do feel like we need to sharpen our pencils, to be really straightforward and true. The pencils should be sharp no matter what the milk price is, because, oftentimes when the milk price is high, the feed cost is also high, and really the margin may be the same. But I do think that when we see a pullback in milk prices and a tightening of margins, first thing is non-nutritional. It's like you better be really in sync with your risk management team and really be on top of all that. And I don't really spend a lot of my brain cells in that area. Most of what I work with, people say use use replacement type prices in your rations anyway. But I think that creativity is probably going to be critical, and that may be creativity and cost savings. It may be creativity on cow grouping. I don't know. It'd be interesting to look at the difference between one group TMRs in the north versus the south. We find that usually feeding multiple rations is what we usually do, and I think most of our clients expect that and expect us to make sure that we're making the right investments for the right cows. Working on the little things like maybe shrink and forage quality, making sure that we're really dotting our I's and crossing our T's. Maybe something like the truth is we ought to be doing it all the time. And I use 2009 as my describer for this, but 2009 was a rough year in the dairy industry. And if you lived through it, you remember it. But we learned some things in 2009 that I think we still utilize. And so whenever there's a contraction in margins, we tend to get smarter, and that helps when those relax and there's a little bit easier path to make some money. I think we probably make more money. Milking the right cows, reproduction always matters. Maybe when milk prices are higher, margins are better, you can be successful with a little less of a awesome reproductive program. When times get tight, those late lactation cows, if you got $25 milk versus $15 milk, the cow that got pregnant late that's just kind of limping along with trying to get that baby so she can finally go dry, she's probably going to have more profitability with that. Obviously, the better milk price. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have got her pregnant no matter what the milk price was, but the fact that she is where she is just an example of getting cows pregnant on time. Makes every nutritionist look good. It makes every balance sheet look good. And so I think just watching those investments, and I should always, I feel like I'm a proponent lately of I've spent a lot of time talking to people about optimized rations lately. I've heard the term thrown around a lot lately, and it doesn't always mean what I mean. And when I say optimization of rations, I mean using either the linear or the nonlinear optimization function in the ration models to let the algorithms in the models and the iterative solutions come up with a ration that's better and cheaper than I could come up with myself just by moving pounds around. And so there's a fair amount of pushback for the topic of optimization. And my encouragement would be is get ready, because you may go from not liking optimization to about to be replaced by some kind of AI bot that's not just using optimization and algorithms, but doing it in a machine learning way that really is going to perhaps change the way we feed cows. And this is happening already. So my interest in that area is to protect the biology from the math, and to make sure that the algorithms and the speed with which we can do things and coming up with rations doesn't run away and leave some of the biology behind, and thereby we won't feed cows as good. We might feed them quicker, we might feed them cheaper, but we won't feed them as good. And so, yeah, if a dairy or a nutritionist isn't optimizing diets, the margins of 2026 might be a time to see if there's 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 cents or more of savings if they'll open up and maybe not feed their favorite ration, but feed a cheaper ration that will have the same results.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks, Steve, for being here. I'm Steve Martin from DNMC Milk. And if you guys have any questions about the podcast, feel free to email in or contact Steve directly. So thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you for listening to the Hoards Dairyman podcast. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. See you next time.